Hey, welcome back to Guardbeardia. Back to you with the next chapter of the Emily Braun series. This may be the only chapter for a week or two since the Belle Dame is off having a nice little vacation with her family, so things may slow down on the Emily Braun side for a short amount of time. I also want to apologize for how slow things have gotten over the past week and a half. I go through a few spells due to my injuries, so I had to work through that, but I should be back online hopefully for a while. But anyway, here's the next chapter of the Emily Braun series. Hope you enjoy.
Chapter 3, Part 2. After hanging out with Marill for a few hours, eating a bowl of cheesy instant noodles and discussing with Marill about what other kinds of shadow creatures there were, Emily began to tire around 2 a.m., making her way to bed and falling face first into her sheets after a short shower. The morning after, she didn't dream again, and noticed the small blue gem of the ring on her finger was glowing again. However, it always seemed to die down after her slumber. That morning, the company area was awash in activity, as many of the new divers had gotten back from their runs, and even a few new faces were there to see and meet. One man in particular, named Jamesha, caught her attention, mostly for the fact he was the only person in the area who didn't have flesh. Yarpuya was a harpy, Marill was a centaur, Tarj was a half-orc, and the rest were all human. But they all had flesh and blood. Jamesha, from what she understood, was a construct of some kind from a small splinter dimension that popped up for a few days and split, not being one of the major dimensions that currently occupied Terra's bubble. Whoever built him, or designed him, took a lot of time in the craft of his metallic parts, making them look as human as possible with well-muscled arms and legs that had small channels running all around them, which to Emily looked like a kind of sleeve tattoo. There was, however, an issue with his head. Instead of a cyborgish face that looked human, it was instead just a human skull, complete with glowing blue eyes and pearly silver teeth that hid away in his inner mouth. Even now she could hear a light tinking, something that she learned he did with his tongue when he was thinking, tapping it against his teeth. Emily stepped into the company area with a slight wave, which Marill returned and gave her a cheery smile. Yarpuya was still snoring on the low futon, her wings wrapped around her knees as her head lolled back on the top of the sofa bed. Inside her knees, Emily could see some kind of doodad she had found, tucked down in the middle of her thighs as if it were an egg. Tarj was fiddling with the espresso machine and grimacing, his bushy eyebrows furrowed as the portafilter refused to obey his command to mate with its receiver. Emily rolled her eyes and began to saunter over, knowing the big oaf was probably trying to make a dirty chai again. "Out of the way, meathead," Emily drawled, bumping him with her hip before leaning in and grabbing the portafilter from his hand. Unlike Yarpuya, who was small, cute, lithe, and bubbly, Tarj acted and looked like he had come out of a Dungeons & Dragons character creation page. Short-cropped yet fashionable hair, small dainty low jaw tusks that poked out slightly from his lips, and Emily could reckon he was good-looking enough for being a half-orc. She had seen orcs before, and they were born with faces for radio, every one of them. "Sorry, Emily," Tarj growled, puffing a breath from his nose and stepping slightly to the side. Emily didn't have the weight to move him, as he probably had about 50 pounds of muscle on her, so the sidestep out of her way after the hip bump was more out of politeness. "This thing doesn't like me." Emily put a shot glass under the filter, clicking on the machine to run. This shot glass had sparkling pink letters reading Bubble Butt, and she made a guess that it was Yarpuya's. "To be fair, you did try to intimidate it last time after it wouldn't start pushing water through the filter." Tarj grumbled and crossed his arms, staring angrily at the now hissing filter. "How was I supposed to know you had to refill the water cavity?" Emily chuckled to herself and went ahead, making Tarj his dirty chai in her barista fashion. Within minutes she could hear the telltale clicking of Yarpuya coming up behind her, and sure enough, her bright, happy face poked around her elbow. "Yo will trade dish duty for special Emily caramel latte." "Sure, at least this time I know you won't get caramel on your feathers again." Emily grabbed the mug Yarpuya usually used off the hook rack, a wild-looking thing that was covered in blood splatters and themed after horror movies. "It was a one-time thing. Yoy has big fingers and bottle was slippery." Yarpuya flexed her 3 avian digits that were on her wings, and Emily eyed them. It was the only non-cute thing about the harpy, as the claws reminded her vaguely of a velociraptor, and were dwarfed by the one she had on her feet. She reckoned that those talons could even put a cassowary to shame. As she began crafting Yarpuya's latte, she heard a polite clearing of throats behind her, and she looked up angrily from the machine, a ferocious grin playing across her face. She knew those throats, and she turned around, the machine burbling away. "Good morning, Augie." Ogledoc and 3 other divers were standing in front of her, while Marill was avoiding the line and just getting a glass of apple juice for her morning sup. The other 3 were Davis, Jeremy, and Tom, survivors from the southern and lower Midwestern states. Emily found them to be needy and annoying, but at least they slipped money under her door for making them drinks. Davis was a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed brunette that looked every part a college freshman, except instead of diving into test, he was doing his best to swipe relics and survive. Jeremy looked every part the bum-truckle redneck from Kentucky, from his beat-up cowboy boots to the constant glob of dip on his lip. Emily found the habit repulsive and almost had a conniption when in the early days of her stay he had tripped and flung some of his spit bottle on her arm. Tom never really said anything, except for when he wanted a coffee, using short sentences before retreating back to his chair to drink and watch the news. Emily was pretty sure she had never seen his eyes, as he always wore his ball cap low and the rest of him was hair and beard. Ogledoc, however, was the same as ever, except he was growing his mohawk out further, and was only a few inches from being able to fit into a big hairband from the 70s. She was never sure how he managed to keep it so neat, probably some kind of elven trickery. "Ogledoc will do," he said dryly, before a slight wave of dark purple washed over his eyes. "And if you make me a latte, I'll get you into the office first for whatever you found." Emily couldn't help but push on her alluring charm, leaning back on the counter with her elbows and raising her head slightly, locking Ogledoc's lavender eyes with her own emerald greens. Targe and Yarpuya looked from her to Ogledoc, then to each other with little knowing smiles on their faces. "Done and done, Mr. Boss Man." Tom gave a small chuckle, everyone looking over at him now in surprise. "You remind me a lot of my ex-wife," Tom said, his huge mustache curling with his smile. Emily had her mouth open in a surprised grin. Was she as pretty as me?" Emily said with a chuckle, and she could see Ogledoc looked annoyed that his thunder was stolen by the larger human. Tom reached over and took the mug of his that was now full of espresso, then snagged the container of warmed milk. He poured the milk in, he set the container back, then turned his back to the group, walking away towards his chair. "With those sparkling greens?" was the only thing he said, and even Yarpuya couldn't help but giggle and turn to watch him walk away, while Targe wiped away at the froth on his lip. Most words I've heard him say at one time since I got here. Ogledoc put his hands on his hips, then the tips of his long hair were starting to ignite with little flecks of red and orange. Yeah, whatever, the big human said words, let's all get our coffee and get pay sorted." Yarpuya nudged Targe in the belly with her avian elbow and snorted. "Ogledoc mad because Finn was stolen from sales." "Be nice, yoy," Targe said with a smile, as Ogledoc glared at them both. Emily whistled to herself as she made more milk foam, and made sure to draw the shape of her ring in the foam, making little lines from the gem so it looked like it was shining. Everyone else chatted around her about their dives, but when she turned around with a mug full of latte in her hand, she saw Ogledoc's colors cool from passionate warm hues to cooler tones, and he took the mug with an almost childish smile. "Let's go, boss man, this diver's got a shopping list in her mind." Ogledoc had a little more bounce in his step when they both went into his office, and Emily was always tickled by how he reacted to her making him things. One day she had brought him a coffee from a local barista when she was out running an errand. She noticed that he didn't like it nearly as much as the one she would make on the company machine. After getting a long sip on the mug, he wiped the milk froth mustache from his lips with his sleeve and pulled out a rather odd-looking machine from a drawer in his desk. She watched as he pulled out a shimmering cord that looked like it was made of liquid and plugged it into a converter attached to his computer, which began to hum faintly. "So, what did you find on your first dive?" Emily pulled off the ring from her finger, not having taken it off since the first time she had put it on, and when she did, she felt a wave of uneasement rippled down her flesh, and she had to blink a few times as tears attempted to well up in her eyes. "What the hell?" she thought as she wiped away at the corner of her eyes. Ogledoc looked up in surprise. don't feel bad about getting a little emotional. A lot of divers feel that way after their first find and surviving to tell the tale. Of course, you probably had an easier time around Kennewick. Right. Kennewick. Emily had forgotten she was supposed to go to Kennewick in the first place, not Walla Walla. Ogledoc gave her a funny look before taking the ring and holding it with his thumb and pointer finger, rolling it back and forth on the pads of the two fingers as his eyes flowed over the scrolling letters on the band. Emily's mind was suddenly flashing with the faces of the slain and the long dead, and the keening screech of the mulzug. The smell of the rotting flesh and earth was almost crawling up into her nose and threatening to choke her with the very memory of its stench. Her stomach gave a churn, and she fought viciously at the bile that was attempting to crawl up her throat. "So, what did I find?" Ogledoc looked at her from the ring. "Fae. Old Fae. Fae royalty, judging by the gem. These are dream gems, something you can only find deep within the realms of magic and other materium." He placed the ring on the plate of the odd little machine, and it began to purr and whistle like some kind of odd animal. The liquid-looking cord began to thrum and pulse orbs of light towards Ogledoc's computer. He looked at the screen and began scrolling through whatever program he was using, his lavender eyes flicking back and forth through the lines of text. Emily placed a hand on her stomach and the other as a fist against her mouth. For some reason she kept re-smelling the flesh mound, and it was making her want to blow chunks all over his desk. After she regained her composure, she took her fist away from her mouth. "What is the program you're using, or whatever?" Ogledoc continued scrolling. "We all kinda whipped it up together using magic and acrotech. You could call it a dimensional lost and found. Are you okay?" Ogledoc looked towards Emily, and the colors of worry flicked across the strange freckles on his face. Emily was white in the face, and her morning coffee kept trying to crawl its way out of her mouth. "I'm fine. Just nervous is all," Emily panted, snagging a bottle of water from his desk and taking a large chug of it. She blew out a breath, then looked back at Ogledoc. "What is it?" "The Mourner's Band. Was stolen from the Fey realm, an ancient artifact of old royalty." Ogledoc leaned back in his chair, which squeaked lightly. "There was a king who was in love, deeply in love, with the elven woman he had grown up with. They lived together as husband and wife for hundreds of years before a sickness took the wife from him." He scrolled a few more times, skimming over the text flowing into his computer. "When she died on their final night together, leaving the realm of the living while in his arms, he was overcome with grief. He wouldn't eat or sleep because of the sadness that was so deep within him. He began to waste away, and their children began to panic. In desperation, they reached out to the gremlins, master of the forge and bellows, and asked them in trade for a favor to make their father a ring. Thalamai the Rose, a master ring maker, took the job in exchange for something, it doesn't say. But in the end, she made a ring that would absorb the nightmares and help stabilize his body. While it helped him sleep, the ring could only do so much, as he saw the face of his long-lost wife and the faces of his daughters. And the king ended up taking his own life so that he could once again be with his beloved. The ring has been kept in a treasury since then, but went missing a few weeks ago." Emily now wanted to snatch away the ring and tuck it back on her finger, which explained the mystery of why she felt so good and slept so well despite the shit she had gone through. But she held back, squinting a watery eye at Ogledoc and sniffing slightly. "Royalty, eh? Yeah, seems like it. Reward for recovery is..." He typed at the keyboard a few times before smiling a little. $65,000 before I take my cut. Mind you, this is conversion, unless you want to deal with converting gold coin. Emily, despite her burst of sickness, launched up from her seat and threw her hands up in the air. "Fuck yeah! Easy peasy!" She had just enough time to bend down and grab Ogledoc's wastebasket, which thankfully had a bag in it, before blowing out the contents of her light breakfast of coffee and the remnants of dinner into the bottom of the basket. Ogledoc looked on in horror as Emily voided into the bag, heaving out a breath or two before spitting and leaning back, her bloodshot eyes looking into Ogledoc's. "Peasy." "Right. Well, after the company's cut of your fine, that's gonna leave you with around 52 grand for you to use on expenses. Not sure how you found something like this in Kennewick, but congratulations all the same." Ogledoc stood up and held out a hand to Emily, who took it and gave it a soft shake. "All in a day's work," Emily said hoarsely, before her stomach gave her another heave, and she had to poke her head back into the wastebasket that she was holding with her other hand. Ogledoc reached out and quickly held up her bangs, which threatened to dip into the stomach soup that was currently occupying the small wastebasket. and Emily muttered a soft thank you from the echo of the bag. Despite the rough start to the day, Emily was in a jubilant mood when she left Ogledoc's office, her first find, even with the close call of being turned into gooey steak for little monsters, netted her a year's worth of pay in only the rough time of a single month. Even though she kept getting snapshots of the things the ring had been keeping out of her mind, she was still not going to let it ruin her mood. The first thing on her mind was dealing with her motorcycle. She loved her shadow, she really did, but she needed something more off-road that could deal with the beat-up old flat tops that she experienced in Walla Walla, or more importantly, be able to go off-road when necessary. After getting her payout from Jane and depositing it into her bank, she headed out with the intent on finding someone around here that sold motorbikes or could maybe do some work on her shadow that made it more off-road worthy. After just setting out into town, she felt her stomach rumble and remembered that she had lost most of her calories this morning during the change-out, and pulled over to a local breakfast joint that she liked to frequent due to their Dutch babies. Sugar may not be the best choice on an empty stomach, but she was keen on celebrating one way or another. Calamity Mames may have not been the best name for a breakfast and lunch diner, but the divers who lived around Logan made it their home for comfort food. As Emily walked in and took off her motorcycle jacket, Tootie, the main counterwoman, waved at her. Tootie was an elf that was obsessed with greaser culture ever since she arrived on flooded Terra and got her hands on the movies that the humans had crafted throughout the years. Tootie, her full name being Tuturial Dathena, came in around the first class of dimensions, popping out around a barn down in Oklahoma with the rest of her curious tribe. After becoming baptized in the culture of the 1960s, Tootie embraced tight jeans and leather jackets as if they were the greatest invention of the human race, much to the delight of every male within viewing distance. Today was no different as Tootie-heeled leather bike boots clacked towards her, the elf opening her arms wide for a hug. Tootie planted a scarlet-red kiss on Emily's cheek while hugging her tightly, wiggling back and forth and shaking her.
Emily, so good to see you, doll. I thought you had died. Hello, Tootie.
Emily gasped, trying to keep the elf's blonde hair from getting in her nose and mouth. Despite the elf's small and sleek stature, she had enormous arm strength for someone her size. I see you're trying updos now. Tootie released an arm and leaned back, pushing up her hair with her palm in a very flirty manner.
They're called victory coils. Saw them and just had to try them. Also got this nice bomber jacket from a rift diver. Said it may be vintage.
Emily leaned in and saw that the jacket indeed looked almost brand new, and she thought she saw the black tag reading Aero Industries before she could ask just how the diver got it. Tootie turned with a wiggle of her hips and pointed Emily towards a small booth that was free, her long, elegant finger ending in a bright, fire-engine red nail.
You can go ahead and sit over there. I'll get you a menu.
The old vinyl booth seat made the usual embarrassing noises associated with the things, and Emily placed her helmet on the tabletop. Tootie came back quickly with a menu and a cup of coffee for her, but before she could skip away and flirt more tips out of people, Emily snagged the edge of her jacket. Hey, Tootie, do you know anyone around here who sells or fixes motorbikes? Tootie smiled brightly with her fanged teeth, and her long elven ears gave a twitch.
Oh yeah, Oliver and his little gang of misfits run a motorcycle shop down in the corner of 500 and Main. Hard to miss the smell.
Tootie winkled her nose, then skipped away, moving towards a man who was holding up his empty coffee cup. Her breakfast of a small Dutch baby and almost an entire pot of coffee gurgled away in her stomach as the shadow roared down Main Street, making her way towards Oliver's shop. Just as Tootie mentioned, the smell of oil and gasoline was hard to miss, and even now a large gas truck was pumping fuel into their underground tank. Oliver's shop looked like it used to be some kind of gas station before he turned it into a motorcycle shop, and all around two-wheeled modes of transportation sat, warming in the sun. Emily was in her element here, even if a good portion of Oliver's crew were gremlins and goblins. Oliver himself was a nice enough man, pushing into his 50s as hard as his hairline was pushing away from his forehead. Despite his graying hair and failing eyes, everyone in the breakfast shop agreed he was a master at working with motorcycle engines and had a soft crush on Tootie, who always gave him butter despite his medical druid telling it was bad for his blood. Around Oliver was the crew of gremlins and goblins that he was teaching everything he knew, all of them black thumbs in body and soul. The gremlins, Fae, who embraced iron and steel, all wore their human forms, choosing to mask themselves as Germanic-looking men in their 30s. while the goblins just looked like their regular selves. Goblins. Even before she took off her helmet, she could hear their French accents echoing out from the shop. "Hey, look at the sopping of that shadow!" A strong High German accent answered him. "Indeed, looks as if she could bend your fat arse into a bow, Dummkopf." The two voices rose as others began to laugh at them, and Emily heard the metallic ring of a wrench being thrown from somewhere inside the garage. As far as she was aware, goblins and gremlins got together as well as oil and water, and could only imagine what kind of hell Oliver went through on the daily. Regardless, she walked up, nodded in return at what she assumed was a gremlin hanging out on a stack of tires, and pushed past the door. A small bell clanged quietly from above the door, and the gremlin's face from atop the tire stack contorted in aggravation, wiggling his fingers in his ear. Oliver was reading a newspaper from behind his small desk, Emily having to weave through rows of motorbikes to get to him, and saw the headline for this issue was, "The Body Rafts, Are They Alive or Dead?" Emily couldn't help but pause as she read that headline, and Oliver gave a small sniff. "Stories about some divers who found large rafts of bodies drifting along the coast, probably corpses from the great drowning that weren't eaten. One of the divers said that they got close enough and saw a body point at him, but I'm calling bunk on that." Emily sat her helmet down on a small chair beside Oliver's desk and unzipped her jacket. "Stranger things have happened, Mr. Oliver. I mean, you have gremlins in your garage right now." "Only because they're too big for mouse traps," Oliver said with a chuckle, and he set down the paper, rolling it slightly so it was contained. "I don't know, billions of people were snuffed out overnight when the waters rose and then eaten by whatever crawled out of the water. For all I know, there is a raft of living people out there." Oliver got a far-off look into his eye for a moment, his fingers rubbing together slowly as some kind of memory played across his brain, before he came back to reality and looked over at Emily. "So what brings you in? Hard to knock a shadow, and yours sounded pretty good when it was pulled up." "Well," Emily began, sitting on the other free chair that was beside the one her helmet sat in, "I went on a dive recently." "A female diver, eh?" he interrupted, leaning forward slightly in attention. "Not many of those come back. Good on you for not becoming breakfast." Emily's mind flashed back to the memory of dirty blonde hair and the slow movements of worms. "Yeah, thanks. But when I was out on this dive, my shadow couldn't handle anything past the hardtop." "Well, yeah, it's a road bike," Oliver chuckled. "Shadows were never built for doing much outside of gravel roads. What you need is an adventure bike, something robust that can handle the abuse." Emily pointed over her shoulder. "What about just turning my shadow into an adventure bike?" "Well, we could do that, but it would never be as good as Ural or the new Zundap R39 Berg medals from the Germans." Emily cocked her head slightly. "There are still Germans?" "Oh, yeah. Munich survived along with Austria and a good portion of the Czechs. Gremlins have been helping them out a lot, since they both share a common language." "Nothing weird there," Emily said dryly. "Everything is weird nowadays, just as you say." Oliver laughed quietly and stood up, grabbing a cane that looked like it was built from multiple engine crankshafts. "Come on, our larger flying friends dropped off a small shipment of both last month." In the rear of Oliver's shop was a newer addition that acted as a warehouse. The main interior filled with racks in which crates of motorcycles rested and lay in wait for a buyer. On the ground floor were rows of larger crates that were slightly wider than the others that stood on the shelves. A third of these crates were marked with Russian letters, while the others were marked with German, both of which sporting the names of the bikes that lay within, Ural and Berg medal. A gremlin that introduced himself as Ludwig began to regale her about both motorcycles, what they came with, and what they could do. Emily got the impression that it almost came down to style, as the two bikes seemed to share a lot of the same characteristics. Bergmetall Zundaps combine the best of KS 750 and the R75. Double-seat robust sidecar and large off-road tires. Urals are tried and true and have a single seat and lighter sidecar. Best for lighter operations. Both can be yours today. For the right price, of course. "What price we talking about here?" Emily asked, who was now walking around the crates. The Urals seemed to only come in red, judging by her limited knowledge of Russian, and the Zundaps came in black, gray, blue, and brown. A goblin held a clipboard towards Oliver, his overalls stained with hundreds of grease and oil marks. "Mon ami, Oliver flipped through a few pages from a clipboard, clicking his tongue softly as he worked his way through the languages. Urals are gonna be 18,000. To be competitive, while the Zundaps are running 21,000. Emily came to a stop in front of a darker-toned crate near the rear of the stack, and she leaned in, resting her hands on her knees as she read through the stamped black German words. Hinter, alt, Muster? Ludwig walked over and bent down with her, reaching out and touching the letters. This means ambush pattern. Emily couldn't help but breathe in, noticing that gremlins all seemed to share the same smell. It reminded her of hot metal, coal, fire, and pine needles. It wasn't unpleasant, and reminded her a lot of how a rolling engine smelled. Ambush pattern, eh? Well, let's have a look at her. I'm mighty interested. Ludwig yelled out to another gremlin in High German, and a crate breaker clinged into his hand from above. Stand back, miss. Oh, I'll stand back all right, Emily murmured, and watched with a slight appreciation at how the gremlin's back muscles and arms flexed as he tore open the crate. Emily's getting a little thirsty. Only a few short strokes, cutting the show short, much to Emily's disappointment. The crate was broken open, and Ludwig held one side still aloft so she couldn't see. Mechanical perfection, Ludwig said with a flourish, and let the crate side drop with a loud crash to the ground. When the motorbike came fully into view, Emily knew that Ludwig had no chance. The bike's paint color was a classic tricolor camouflage, made famous by being on the Panthers of old, with little speckled dots of color all over to help break up the pattern further. It smelled of new industry, rubber, steel, and much to her delight, leather. The two seats were wrapped in delicious dark brown hide, and the sidecar sported the same kind of material all the way inside its interior. Instead of metal saddlebags, it had the classic leather ones instead. The buckles and clasps blackened, and the leather oiled so it shined in the lights of the warehouse. Emily breathed out almost lustily as she trailed her fingers down the handlebars, the modernized display, the gas tank, and she drummed her fingers lightly on the leather seat, feeling it push back against her fingers a little with its inner cushion. The more she looked, the more she liked. The sidecar not only sported a battery system for recharging electronics, but also a spare tire and 3 more saddlebags for storage on its front and side. Fuel can could be seen poking out from the interior of the sidecar, and she was beginning to think she would have no need for her trailer anymore when it came to this little beauty. The Zundap oozed an old-fashioned style, robust muscle, and classic charm, which rendered Emily unable to speak as she walked around it. Most important of all was that the wheels were aggressive-looking off-road tires, and she had little doubt that this could have carried her to Walla Walla and back with little effort. Well, she panted, pleased, and Emily looked up to Ludwig, who was standing by and watching her with a content yet smug engineering smile. I was going to ask you out to dinner to see what else those muscles could do, but I'm afraid I may have found a better date. Ludwig grinned and held out a small dangling key. I know when I am vested. Oliver made paying a painless process, not that Emily was complaining, and offered to have her shadow dropped off at the company by his crew so she could enjoy the first ride, and Emily agreed happily. Thanks to the miracle of the internet, she had it insured before the money had even left her account. She said sorry to her shadow as she passed it, but she couldn't help but bounce on her feet when Ludwig hurled out her new Zundap into the sun for the first time. All ready for you. Double-checked grease, oil, fuel is as full as the spare battery charged. Selector on start. Best of luck to you. Emily swatted at Ludwig playfully with a hand as she gleefully hopped onto the front seat. Yeah, whatever, man-meat, out of the way. Ludwig blew a raspberry at her, wiggling his fingers under his chin, but couldn't stop himself from grinning as wide as Emily when she turned over the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, spat out a little cloud of smoke, then settled into an idle purr. She gave the accelerator a slight twist and closed her eyes, listening onto the growl of the exhaust. When she was ready, she slipped her helmet onto her head. Still sure we can't go to dinner? Ludwig yelled over the noise of the engine, leaning in towards Emily. But she shoved him away, her teeth flashing from inside her visor as she clicked the engine into first and roared off on the motorbike. The ride back to the company building was actually quite relaxing, as Emily had never ridden with a sidecar and found the stability something that she could get used to. Leaning into turns was interesting, but overall the Zundap would do the job well if she had to make a guess. When she arrived back at the parking lot, Yarpuya was watering her flowers, a weird hobby she had gotten into, and saw Emily pull into a space. Yarpuya saw the sidecar, and Emily ended up making another circuit around town, the harpy screaming faster while leaning forward over the sidecar to catch more of the wind in her face. A few times Emily had to shove her back into the sidecar, the harpy giggling madly, because Yarpuya would try and sit on the top plate of the sidecar, spreading her legs and gripping the edges with her feet. "Watch the paint!" was becoming Emily's new catchphrase with Yarpuya, but she had to admit the infectious laughter of the harpy was beginning to take hold of her. When they got back to the company, Yarpuya scrambled out of the sidecar and into the front door, only to drag out Tarj and push him towards the bike. Another circuit, this time with Yarpuya sitting in the seat behind Emily and Tarj screaming in terror from the sidecar. Emily found this hilarious. She finally had to yell, "Oh, quit your bawling, you big green baby," before taking them around a tighter corner, the tire squealing almost as loudly as Tarj was, while Yarpuya just screamed in delight. After this, she came back into the parking lot and saw that Ogledoc was waiting, sitting on the curb with a helmet in between his knees. Emily rolled her eyes as Tarj got out, legs wobbling, and Yarpuya chased after him, giggling, running around the bike to make fun of him. "I'm gonna have to charge the company fuel costs for this, you know." Ogledoc said nothing, but held up 2 cards, both of them reading, "One free frozen yogurt cup, size medium." Emily bobbed her head back and forth a few times and thought, "All right, fine, but you're riding in the sidecar, not behind me." "Ooh, such a buzzkill," Ogledoc said, strapping on the half-helmet and stepping inside the sidecar. Emily leaned back in her seat and nudged him on the shoulder with her elbow as he got comfortable. "Yeah, I don't know where those hands are gonna want to go." Ogledoc wiggled his goggles down from the top of his helmet and placed them in front of his eyes, a sneaky smile crawling across his lips. "Haven't a clue what you mean."
And that's the end of this chapter of the Emily Braun series. If you like this video and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel of Yarpuya, as well as click the bell icon so you know when the videos are released through the week and you can watch them when they're fresh out of the oven. If you really enjoy this series on this channel, by all means donate to the coffee. And if you're donating specifically to the Beldam and her amazing voice acting, be sure to label it as such when you make the donation so that way I can give her all of the money that she deserves. But until I see you next time on this side of the veil, this has been Yarpuya.